Hello everyone and welcome to the iSpring webinar. Today we have our 7th lesson and I can't believe we have only 3 left out of the whole webinar series about... I just realized that I forgot the name. How to create great content from A to Z, right? Thank you, Michael. So today we're going to be talking about user interface and user experience and best practices for that. And I just want to remind you that we have with us our very special Michael Shiashi to cover this topic for us. Hi, Michael. How are you doing today?
Hi, Pauline. I'm doing great. Thanks.
Awesome. Michael is a technologist at Alternative Media, and we just all love him for his passionate way of presenting and for revealing great secrets. So thank you very much, Michael. And I have also invited to help with all your question, guys, our senior technical support engineer, Paul Bender. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining. What's up?
Hi, Pauline. Thanks for having me. Everything's good. Waiting for questions.
Wonderful. And I just want to mention that, like always, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So guys, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to submit them in the question box. And we will cover them either during the Q&A session itself, or if these are specifically iSpring related questions, Paul will cover them in the chat box right during the webinar. And I also wanted to mention that today we were planning to have an open mic. So whenever we will have a discussion topic and Michael will announce it, I think, we are going to pick one person out of our attendees and just provide them with the opportunity to speak out and share their opinion on the certain topic. And I also wanted to remind you that at the end of the webinar series, we're going to pick the top 3 answers to the question, what you guys learned at the webinar series, and you should share them under the main blog post for the series. And you will receive 60, 45, or 30-minute online consultation with Michael, and you will be able to address your e-learning questions to him, cover your e-learning project, something that you are not sure about, and hopefully Michael will be able to help you guys. All right, so I think at this point I've covered all the necessary details, and we're ready to begin. So Michael, let me please pass the mic over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Okay.
All right. And I should be showing my screen. And Paulina, do you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. And thank you, Paulina and iSpring, for hosting these really great webinars in this series. As Paulina mentioned, we're at number 7 today. So that's fantastic. We only have a few short ones to go out of 10. So today we're going to talk about practical application, user experience, and user interface, and the best practices for e-learning content. So jumping right into it, it's all about me. So my learning background, I've been working in IT and e-learning for 20 years or so. I have a background in film and Native American Studies, Masters of Fine Arts and 3D modeling for games simulations. So I really try to push home the innovation part of e-learning as we go through it. And as Paulina mentioned, today is our start of listening to you, our participants, about what you wanted, and you've asked for more active participation, and we want to give that to you. So we want to make sure things go smoothly. My style, as I keep reminding everyone, is casual and conversational. Remember that you can put questions in chat or as we open up the mic to allow you to ask your questions verbally. Hopefully we get more interaction today. And as well, you can tweet at MAS_eDev or iSpring Pro. So let's keep the discussion going. So taking a look at last week, we talked about different ways to engage the learner and different levels of interactivity. We looked at, what's the point, and the difference between an interactivity is doing something, maybe on screen or on the device. Engagement is for our audience or participants or our learners to actually have internal value, and that's what we need to make sure we have both. We talked a little bit about gamification and the differences of. I pointed out a really great resource on iSpring that's available to read, and a video from Andrew Hughes that really talks about the different levels. There's a graphic here showing what the different levels are and the types of gamification or game design or serious games. So check that out when you can. We also talked about interactivity as branching, what we can do inside of iSpring and our e-learning content to branch out to create sort of, I like to call, choose your own adventure type of experiences for our learners, making sure that we invest the time to create very robust learning that the user can go through and have different outcomes or different experiences each time. So, and with this, we have to shift our mindset away from the linear page by page by page turner idea to a more, literally a more branched mindset where we have to consider various outcomes or restarts or various ideas. So I did take a look and demo the how to do this branching. And we looked at a way to do it with TalkMaster. We did a power of threes, meaning we did 3 different answers and 3 different responses to that, giving everyone sort of an experience of what it's like to do that in TalkMaster. So things to be considered when branching: is it okay to fail? Can they restart? Can they see it again? And then we took a look at different examples, including my own FAQ using the TalkMaster based on Army of Darkness and Ash versus Evil Dead. So let's take a look at where we've been and where we're going today. Week 7. And again, we're talking about UI, UX. And next week, we talk about different ways to put a really high polish on your e-learning, things you should consider all along in your process, but also as you finish up, making sure that your product and your content is efficient, viable, and accessible. And then in week 9, we'll talk about publishing and sharing options. And then finally, in week 10, we'll look at the best of and some really great examples of e-learning. So let's take a look at the obligatory objectives slide. And so today we're going to talk about UI, UX, obviously, why it's important, and some best practices. Of course, within that, we'll talk about font and typography, hopefully, and using some templates or some built-in functionality with an iSpring, and maybe adding some interactivity as we go along. As we finish up, there'll be a demo of how to make sure that we bring it all home to our learner and customize the iSpring player. So with that, let's get started. And the first poll question, if we could, Paulina. So do you currently have time allotted in your process for UI or UX?
All right. So guys, if you can really quickly take the vote and click on the option yes or no. And after that, we will allow just a couple of more moments for you to do that. And after that, I will gladly launch the results for this poll question. And so far it looks like more than a half of our attendees voted, and so far the percentage is 41 yes and 59% no.
Right, thank you. And that's not surprising as we go along. Let's just have a couple more seconds here to allow people to vote. So it's not surprising. And again, this is something we want to consider as we have the development process, is allowing time for both UI and UX design, as well as getting information from our learners. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So thank you, Paulina.
And here is one comment from Stephanie. I don't even know what UI or UX is.
Well, speaking of that, so let's talk about the basic concepts for UI and UX. So UI, or user interface design, is a science. It's a hardcore science. It's a lot of information, and a little preface to both of these as we talk about both of these. I'll throw on the screen UI and UX, but really we're talking about user interface and user experience. I'll get to the differences in a moment. But these are both very robust and complex, theory-driven fields of study. So we can cover the basics today, but remember that we won't be able to cover everything. So UI, the user interface part, is really dependent on your learner, who's using it, how they use it, what are they going to use on screen, and sometimes it's more or less considered the design. That suggests maybe, oh, it's just graphic design, I'll let a graphic design person take care of it, which is all well and good. But remember, we need to be thinking about how we execute these within our process. And comparatively, the user experience design is also based on hard science, and it can be a whole robust field of study, but it's more focused on function. How does the user do something on screen? You know, what does the learner feel? What is the actual experience? What do they actually do? And so it's meant to ensure that what we do and what we create works well. So I'll back up and show this again. So when we talk about UI, it's about what the learner uses or does, and then the experience part is the UX. So I'm glad you asked that question. So this is the little image here is kind of a sort of summation of it, and it's from Programming Jokes on Facebook, which is a little group that has a whole bunch of different jokes for programmers and developers. And so, as you can see in the little image I had here, so maybe we have a design that we've put out, or the user design, but the actual experience is much different. So you can see in this case the user or the individual has their own path because it's the quickest way to get from point A to point B. So we need to consider that. We need to understand, you know, what our learners want, what we feel like is best for them. We want to reduce frustration. In this case, in this example, we may have a really well thought out pathway, as you can see in the concrete or brick design there. It's well made. It's been executed well. But really, the point A to point B would reduce frustration. For instance, if that straight line that the person was walking there was the actual designed path, it would probably be much better. So what this does in focusing on both of these, it increases, as we're developing content, our credibility, or the content's credibility of being the authority in whatever subject we're talking about. And again, as I suggested earlier when I asked, do you plan for it in your process, you have to consider these ideas early. How are we going to design? Does that affect the learner? Does it affect their experience? So there's a lot of great information online, and I'll quickly flip over to this, the UX Design for eLearning 10 Tips. Let me get to my, oh, and by the way, here's my website at alternativemedia.com. But here is 10 tips, so I'll let you read this. The link is available. It's a lot of good information here about how to put eLearning UX design inside your content. And flipping back to my slide. Of course, as I mentioned, planning is very, very important. Don't ask how we're going to do this, and don't assume anything. Don't assume you know that this is best for the learner without asking the learner or getting information. Be consistent in how you design the UX experience. Make sure that when you design one slide, it has something to do with the other, or that you design slides in a cohesive content that is consistent across the board so that the learner experiences it in the same way each time. Consider whether navigation is important. And again, many of you that have developed eLearning know, okay, we have to put the next button. Well, do you? You have to consider what's best for your learner. And again, this is covered in the article, but I just wanted to go over it. So it also talks about other things like pay attention to daily life. What's around you? What's developed and designed for your user experience around you, be it your laptop, your desk, your ergonomically correct mouse. And so also be responsive. And again, as we talk about all these things, we want to make sure that we're thinking about devices that are on the go, whether it's tablet or phone. Make sure that you look at existing items in the real world and see how they're put together. And your learning journey never ends, meaning take experiences as you go and seek those inspirations out where you can. You can read all this in the article, but I just wanted to cover those. Some additional links I think are really helpful. One from Career Foundry, one from eLearning Industry, and one from usability.gov. We'll take a quick look at each of these. I won't go into them in detail, but I do want to include the links today for you. And this is a really great one, the difference between UI and UX, going back to that question we had. Talks about, what it could be, gives some really great infographics, and has a really interesting video with a banana on what the difference is. You can view that on your own time. So also from the eLearning Industry, there's a good Q&A session here with this individual, with Julie Dirksen. Check that out when you can, and as well usability.gov. So usability.gov obviously is a sort of centralized site to improve the how user experience is put together. So there's a lot of really good information here. Check it out when you can. It's quite robust. I won't go over it today, but I did want you to be made aware of that resource. So. All right, so let's have another quick question. So what's your biggest UI and UX struggle? What really gets you? And Paulina, if we could open up, well, I guess we'll put this in the chat area or let someone get on mic if they want. So having just scratched the surface of not only what it is and why it's important, what struggles do you have, or where do you struggle beyond just the, what is it, and in addition to the tips. So.
And we have a comment from Tanya. Page turner content from our SMEs, subject matter experts.
I think, and so that's a great comment. So I think page turners, and for those of us that remember the very first webinars, I talked about page turners being like level 1 out of level 1, 2, or 3, where we have the obligatory, just slide after slide after slide of just text, maybe with 1 or 2 images, but just text after text after text. I think that is a fantastic example of what we all probably struggle with, of a lot of information and just sequential order of linear information. So as we talked about last week, some of what we talk about in creating this user experience and interface is how do we not only get that information and make it succinct, but how do we make it slightly interactive, as we talked about last week. And that can be part of the UI and UX experience as well. So that's a good comment. Any others, Paulina?
Yes, and then we also have the one from Kathy. Many different experience levels, being able to meet all skill levels and learning levels. And then another one from Randy.
Right, and learning what? I didn't.
Learning levels.
Right, and so we have a bunch of different things we have to cover within our learning, and how do we cover our robust audience as well and our learners. I agree, that's a great struggle. If you remember back to our webinars early on, we talked about different ways, and I used the Starship Troopers video, the movie from the 1990s, talking about would you like to know more? And while it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek, movie, the drilling down of information. So as we create our different experiences, you could possibly create the baseline, and I won't say page turner, but the basic information on screen, but allow the user at various levels to drill down as deep as they need to in the breadth and depth of information, maybe using the different interactions we showed earlier in our webinars, or something like a FAQ, or any of these things to allow additional information, but the core succinct core information is on screen for them. So that's a good thought as well. Anything else, Paulina?
Yes, there was one comment from Lowell. How should we calculate the amount of time to allocate to UI UX development?
Well, that's a good question. So I think a little bit of it goes in each and every step of the phases. I don't have the graphic in front of me, but you may remember from the earlier weeks when I brought up the great table on level 2 of the different tasks from the Chapman Alliance. There are, 184 various development hours needed for 1 seat hour of what we just, learning hour of time. And so within that, there's a bunch of different phases, including front-end analysis, instructional design, even including audio and programming and such. But within each of those, we need to have just touched upon and the foundation of UI and UX. So some of it needs to be in the front-end analysis where you identify your learner and what the objectives are. I would say much of it needs to be done in there, as well as in the design overall, layout process. So, but it needs to be a small portion of each and every delivery, all up until final delivery. So that's a good question. All right, anything else before we move on, Paulina?
Well, actually, we have lots and lots of comments, so maybe we should move on, because I don't know which one to choose. Okay,
let's move on, but if one stands out to you, please jump right in and I'll try to answer it. So
sure, thanks.
Let's look at specifics. So looking at things we can really do other than the theoretical part. So obviously on screen we can control font, and that includes both color and size. And next week we'll talk about contrast ratio on both color and size, and why that's important to what we do for accessibility reasons. And of course general color within the layout of slides and the on-screen imagery. And of course we need to consider images, or any imagery or animations we need to include, and layout and how that looks on various devices. So one very important topic that can be quite robust in itself and can be a huge field of study on its own, can be font and typography. And so there's a couple of quick tips I have, and I'll flash them up on screen real quickly so you can see. And this is another one from the e-learning industry about 5 key tips for learning professionals in creating typography. There's a lot of good information as well, and I've included the links, as well as a 7-step typography lesson for first-time e-learning developers. So the quick overview of both of these, and they're both very important. So from the first article, fewer is better. Try to do no more and no greater than 3 basic elements or sections. So let's go back to this so that you have an understanding. So don't use the different fonts. So if you're going to use type of fonts, and again, this article goes in the various types, sans serif, serif, script, don't use more than 3 types. And that's a big no-no. Of course, if you have a very robust slide, there's always, reasons to do so, but try not to go above 3. On your font type and choice, try to go for something standard, not exotic. And again, those of you that have looked at different font choices that are just tired of the Arial or whatever it is, you know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of different fonts, but really to keep things clear and concise and to provide authority for what we're doing, we want to make sure that we don't go too exotic. We do always want to have some infusion of emotion or some excitement within our e-learning. But sometimes font gives the wrong idea. And for those of you that know what Comic Sans Serif is, the hated Comic Sans Serif, you know what I'm talking about. So font size, try to go with 12, 14, and 16 on the various types. 16 would be for like your title, 14 for the main body, and 12 for smaller font. And then, of course, supporting that is the other article I mentioned from Carla Gutierrez. Use infographics where available, and I think those of us that have done e-learning for a while and know what those are, the sort of rudimentary images that are stylized that show a lot of great information, maybe through graphs and charts or pictograms. For the body of text, only use 20 or 40% of the on-screen space, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. And make sure that you have examples that contrast each other or complement each other. And you can look at the article for a little bit more on that, but that's some just high-level overviews of font and typography. So it can be quite a challenge. So how would you do this in iSpring content? So again, I have some on-screen text here showing what to do. And so one thing you can do, and again, remember that we want to take between 20 and 40% of our on-screen area. So I've turned on grids, as you can see. You can do inside PowerPoint here, just to give you an idea. Maybe a little hard to see on your screen, but there's some dotted lines that show up when you turn grid lines on in PowerPoint. And so what this does is kind of allow you to see a percentage of what you're dealing with on screen. In this case, we look at the lorem ipsum text, which is the large body of text on the bottom left of the slide example here. And you can see that if you divide the slide in half, left and right, you got 50%, and then the body of that text takes the majority of that. So we'll say it's less than 50%, closer to say 38 or 40% of the slide. So we don't want to go over that. And as you look at this, you can see from this example that the text itself looks quite dense. There's a lot of text there. This would probably be a little bit too much text. And so those of us have asked before, what about text area? What about how much do we put and how much do we put on the slide? As you can see from this example, and this again sits around 40% or so, that's a lot. So I would suggest lower than this. You can also use the layout, the content layout. In this case, it's the 2 content, which would be on your PowerPoint slides, a title and two portions of content, be it text or images or media or such. So, and we also want to preview on different devices, which of course you can do inside iSpring's preview area. Another great resource I wanted to alert us to is inside iSpring, and that is the templates. Using the slide templates themselves, wherein you can see you have one example is the 30 to 70 layout, where you have about 30% based on text and 70% images. There's a lot of great examples if you go through those available inside iSpring. And let me just show you where that's located here on screen inside the iSpring suite. It is in the slide templates area here. And I'll just pop that open and we can scroll through for a quick moment. But this is a really great resource and a great way to get started on ways for different layouts. And you see a lot of thought has been put into these, and you can look at navigations and sections, but this is the 3070 ones I talked about, as well as, problem and solution, including some images. So it's a great place to get started. So keep it in mind as you begin considering UI and UX for your specific content. So it also includes, iconography in the icon section or objects where needed. So moving on to user interactivity. So we can also look at creating triggers or animations or what I call reveal on click. And so we can look on how to do those. I remember last week when I showed interactivity, I showed the demo that had 3 individuals, and if you rolled over, each individual would change from a grayed out silhouette into a full image. So there's a lot of information available from iSpring on how to do that. One such is available here on how to add triggered animations in PowerPoint at this YouTube location. So it's a great tutorial and it's quick and easy to view. It's under 2 minutes, so check it out when you get a moment. So. And of course, we talked about branching last week as well, which is part of the interactivity. Something I wanted to alert us to is that as we consider various items, as I shared a lot of resources, quite frankly, whether you're an Android or iOS person, or even as me, I develop for both, the Apple Corporation has done a lot as far as research and really hardcore UI and UX design. So it's a really good idea to take examples and ideas from them. And this goes, for some examples on text size, color contrast, and even spacing, adjusting the line spacing, which I did not cover inside, say, PowerPoint text objects. So taking a quick look, I've included that link for you. They've tried to put it in a really easy to view, this is right, this is not right, sort of idea. And again, this would be for iOS mobile devices. And next week we'll talk about hit targets and what that means, but we need to make sure that as we preview on different devices, the images that we want to click on or the buttons or whatever they are big enough. But here we talk about text size. And so the text should be at least 11 points so it's legible. And I want to touch on that just, so let me back up for a moment. So when we talk about our font, and so remember here, I wanted to talk about that. A lot of us may have issues, and I'll go back to this area here. So here I'm clicking on my font area, and in this space, if I put a lot of text here, let's say this was the 3070 template or whatever, many times your PowerPoint will be set up to autofill to the shape. So we want to make sure that we use actual font choices. And this slide, I've got them at 20. But to help you estimate that, it's more than likely you would want to turn off the autofill, and you would go to Format, and I believe Size, click on that, and we can look at the text options here. And in the text, I don't know, here on this option here, and then we would say Do Not Auto Fit here, and that would keep the size the same point value that you set, which would be here on Home, rather than having it shrink or grow or shrink with this. So I wanted to bring that up because that affects how it looks on screen. You may think that it's not very much, but when we talk about core values of how much to put on screen on a lot of these, we'll talk about specific point sizes, and I wanted to let you know that changes sometimes inside PowerPoint. So let me go back in. So real quickly, let's talk about iSpring and customizing the player, because really, as we get to it, customizing the actual player for the user and learner will be, sort of the finishing touch you'll put on making sure that the experience for the learner is on point. So this takes everything you've done on screen and allows it to be in a succinct and very usable manner. And what I would say is, as you develop your slides and as you develop your content, using the player, I would go in, which we'll do here in a moment, and really look at the different ways and experiment with the different layouts and think about what works best for your learner. Remember, we're advocates for our learner, and make sure that whatever you do has reason, meaning if you choose a certain layout or you remove a certain layout or you customize something, we want to make sure that we have reasons for it, that it benefits our learner, and that we've gotten real feedback from our learner on what that means. So let's take a quick look at the demo. And for this demo, I've downloaded the Space Shuttle content from iSpring, and I'll just click on the slides just on the left here so you can kind of see. This is available from the iSpring website in the demos area. Really well laid out, really clean, really good use of images. So as we look at ways to make sure that the design, the user interface is well laid out, we want to think about making sure that it's visually pleasing for one, obviously. And remember we talked about that earlier, where UI can sometimes be the design part of it. It's not specifically, and it's not to be put it in that container, but we want to make sure we consider that as well. So clicking through these, we also say, okay, we're ready to go. We've done what we can. We want to publish out. And this is where we would adjust our player settings. So on screen, you'll see the player here, and it's set to universal, but we could also customize. But we have universal or video lecture. Let's say we had a lot of information that was available on video from our SMEs or other experts we've added into the course. Or if we just wanted just no player itself and just the content. But most parts, you would probably want to take one of these and customize it. And going into the customizing area, you can see there's a lot of choices. You can use the built-in, and clicking through each of these branded course has an area for your company logo if you want. Again, that would be branded. Has an area for notes and outlines. And again, notes are a great place to put on-screen information. As again, remember you all mentioned, how do I make sure I address different levels? And so adding notes allows you to address that different level if they want to know more information. If you have the core bulleted point information or whatever is very succinct on screen, but you want to have this additional information, you could add it in the notes. There's also business presentation. Again, see, it's different layout. There's no notes, but again, there's an outline where someone can go through. Content only, which would just be slide by slide. Corporate training that includes the player bar and all this other items. Presenter info about who's speaking, maybe a screen headshot. This would be the full and different ones. So go in and try each one of these out, publish it, and see how it works. And then after you publish, and I'll do a quick publish here with one of these. Let's say I use online lecture with video. I will say apply and close. And again, I could adjust, I'll continue to adjust the layout, what's on the top, the colors, anything that I needed. But let's say this was good and that this worked for my learner. I would publish, and I'll take a quick moment and let this do this. It'll take probably 60 seconds or so. But while it's doing it, I wanted to show you this area specifically so you could see how customizable the player is and how you need to think about each of those customizations that representative and the effect for the learner. Does it make sense that they see a video? Does it make sense that they need to see the notes? And it really depends on your learner primarily and the content itself. And of course, we've put a lot of emphasis on developing slide by slide the content and interactivity. But again, as I mentioned, part of the player customization allows all that to come together in a very easy manner, or hopefully easy, or at least usable manner for your learner. As this is published out, we get a preview. And this is the area where you could, sorry, let me mute this. So I've muted it myself. So this has audio, and you have a player bar here. We have the navigation left and right. We have the notes section I talk about. Again, we have a lot of options in this preview. We could see how it looked on tablet and get a live preview. I'll go back to desktop. Okay, and we can go slide by slide and see each one, see how it goes. We can use the outline navigation to view a specific slide. We can take the quiz, we can do all this. We can also do different things, attach it to email, as I talked about, sharing with your stakeholders or your SMEs, and upload to FTP or share via cloud, or we can even go ahead and view in a browser if you'd like. So different ways to customize the player, as well as different ways to view it and share it, all within one location in the publish area. So let's get back to our slides. Okay, so as I mentioned, as we do all this, you have plenty of time. And remember, one of you asked, how much time should we allot to it? It definitely needs to have enough time not only to plan out and design the UI and UX, but also get information from your actual learners. And sometimes that's focus groups, and be it official focus groups where you come in and you have people blind tested and you have a questionnaire after. It can be simply sending it out to one or two learners that you know and trust that can actually go through the run through the traps and make sure everything's working properly. It can be your stakeholders sometimes, but really we need to get whatever our target audience is, our learners that we're advocating for, and get them involved and make sure that it makes sense and is usable and creates a great experience. And remember, by experience, we're talking about ways of making that intrinsic interactivity and engagement better. But we have that buy-in from them and the approval from them as well. So let's do another poll question to get you more involved. So Polina, if we could do the question number 3.
Sure, just a second.
And that gives me plenty of time for a sip of water.
All right, so the question is, do you have UI UX testers that are representative to your learners? And the simple answers are yes or no. And if you guys can quickly take the vote, that will provide us with plenty of information to talk about. Right, Michael?
Yep, so just yes or no. And so I wanted to put this question to us as a group for us to think about it. So since I mentioned it's important, I want to know if we are currently doing it yet. And so I would guess probably a lot of us are not, and that's fine. But as we develop these, remember it's important to think about the entire process and how much time is involved. It may be at this point you want to involve learners early in the design process when you're creating the straw man or wherever you're doing the outline, or maybe also later in the process when you get things sort of cobbled together in some mock-ups. So looks like about 60-40, so the majority of us have not. We don't currently have testers.
Yep.
And so also there is a question about the links. Paulina, if we can make sure we share the links in either in the chat or in the information.
Yes.
So,
so here I just wanted to quickly mention that I have the list of links, but it's not the complete one. So I will be sharing all the links in the mailing that I usually send out to all the webinar attendees after the webinar itself with the webinar resources. That's it.
Right, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. So, and before we move on, are there any comments about previous questions or anything we want to discuss? I think we're about to sum up and get to the discussion part.
Okay.
Paulina, are there?
Yeah, so actually here was one really interesting comment. Let me quickly find it, just one moment. So there is a comment from Kevin. Is it important to use fonts that dyslexics can read easily? For example, experts hate Comic Sans, but dyslexics love it.
That's an interesting question. So on some of the links I shared, I don't think there's mention of that. And quite frankly, that's not something I thought of before. So I think that's a great question. So I would wonder if we could allow, say those, depending on how many users you have that have that need, maybe we test and see what works best for them. And I don't know if there's a way to customize the fonts on the fly, but that might be something as well. So it could also be something as you look at, say, your notes section that we looked on the player. Perhaps it's something they can read in the notes section that's much clearer, which I believe is the sans serif versus what's on screen. So I think with experimentation, that would be a great thing to test out.
Great, and I've also sorted out several comments on the same topics regarding the struggles with UI UX. And so here we have trying to design for various devices users have, first one. The second one, the amount of text.
And those are both very important. And so as we saw earlier, the amount of text can be dependent and really, quite frankly, hard to nail down. But I think if we go back to the examples of both looking at, less than 40%, say on this one, and again, as I mentioned, that's around 40%, and that's a lot of text, and probably too much for this slide. as well as looking at the template layouts. I think that's a great place to start as well. So as the struggles continue and as the struggles are real, so to speak, remember to look towards other examples to get a starting point for some of these. So that's a good point.
And we have a question from Todd. If some of our content is being developed by the subject matter expert, is it possible to create the iSpring template and then export it so it can be used by SMEs when they do the work? Is this what share function does?
Well, as I talked about it earlier, the share was just to share the published experience so that you could have someone else's opinion or get feedback for it. So on that specific technical question, Paul, is it possible to export templates for other iSpring users to import and use?
Hey, I'm here. Templates like the player templates, the settings for the player.
I think in this case they were probably talking about the slide templates as seen on screen here in this area, the slide templates area. Is it possible to save these out if you've customized one of these and allow someone else to import them to use them to recreate slide after slide, let's say? I think that's kind of what the question was about.
I see. No, but you can save them in PowerPoint because all those elements in the templates that we provide with the content library are made through PowerPoint. So they're just plain shapes, text, and images. And once you replace those default images with something, you can just save it in a PowerPoint file and then share with your colleague to let them also work on those templates that you created.
Right. Thank you. That's a good point. And so I think that also brings to mind what we've always said, and that's that if you're using iSpring to create this e-learning content, use the great tool, but also focus on what you know. And many of us are familiar and have been familiar for many eons with PowerPoint. And so, as Paul mentioned very succinctly, that information is saved back and forth within the PowerPoint. So thank you for helping there, Paul. I appreciate it. Let me do the quick sum and then we'll get right into the Q&A section. So again, we talked about what UI and UX is, why it's important, some best practices. We focused a little bit on typography, but we also talked about, as we just mentioned, templates and how to use them and how they're a great starting place. We looked at ways of adding interactivity, say with triggered responses, and we also looked at how the iSpring player can be customized to make sure that the learner gets the best experience. So, Polina, let's go ahead and open it up to questions and discussion if we could.
Sure. So the first question is from Sherry. Do you have a recommended word count or character count per screen?
I don't. And so let's go back to my example here. And again, I won't count the characters for us on this particular one. Remember, this is sitting at around 40%, and I think probably 14-point font. So as you can see here, we have 6 medium-sized words per line, and we have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, around 20 lines. So again, this is too much for me. It can be a little bit more for you. So if that would be fine, that'd be about 100 words, I guess, more or less. I think 100 words, again, is probably quite dense for your use. It really depends on the use. If we had bulleted points, that would change, obviously. If we were talking about a list, either unordered or ordered, numbered or bulleted, that number would change. So it depends on what the content itself and what the message of that slide needs to put out. And so it really depends. But quite frankly, if you have a large body of text, it may be time to drill down into those other interactions that we talked about, the FAQ, the timeline, and the others that we mentioned earlier on in the webinar. So again, having the basic and very concise information for our learners on screen, and then allowing them at, say, their own pace or their own gumption to go and get more information may be a better choice.
All right, thank you. And the next question is from Anne. Going back to the struggle with UI UX. My struggle is the time involved to create interactive courses. Our learners like to skip to the test because of time constraints. Any ideas to keep them engaged for their own good?
And so that's a difficult question, isn't it? Because I really think, when we talk about for their own good, um, quite frankly, maybe they know their own time restrictions better than we do as developers, or maybe they don't. But I think it's important, as we mentioned, to go in and talk or get some information from the learner group themselves, focus groups. I know that's not really your question, but again, we're talking about providing information in ways that have that experience and engagement for our learners to be something they want. And that's, again, as we all know, that can be a hard task. So I don't have any ready-made or easy answers for you, unfortunately. Some ways to do it, as I mentioned, are provide the core information on screen, allow the learner to drill down for more information and see interactions. But really think about, as you consider and develop and design this stuff, what would you want to take? Obviously, some of your learners feel like they just want to get to the end. Maybe you allow them to do it, and then maybe you have feedback on the quizzes that they've rushed to allow them to go back and review information where need be. So there's a lot of ways to skin that cat. I don't have a ready-made answer for you, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. And we have a comment from Johanka. I have this discussion with my stakeholders all the time. I prefer to attach as PDF and only highlight the most important on screen. And then we also have a comment from Stephanie. Time limits only make me nervous, and I can't focus on the material when there are time limits.
I completely agree. But it also depends on your learner. So going back to the previous statement, and then I'll address that in a moment. So, I think it's important as we talk to our SMEs and our stakeholders and those people that help us deliver our information, we make sure that we get the concise information. And your example of highlighting on a PDF just the core information needs to be on screen is a great way to do it. You could also do it, in notes and PowerPoint or however you share information. So, and then getting back to the time limit, I think that's very important. And remember, we can adjust a lot of those settings in our quizzes and what have you. We'll talk next week a little bit about accessibility. I won't dive down deep, but as we look at the different WCAG 2.0, and that's an accessibility conformance requirement, as we look at the various ones, sometimes depending on our learners, we may need to get rid of that time limit or get rid of it for certain audience members. So just like you, many other people either don't like it or have specific reasons they don't want to be timed on a quiz. So I completely agree.
All right, and we have a great comment from Jim. The wall of text effect tends to drag down learners. I try to keep it concise and to the point, letting graphics do a lot of the communication.
That's a great point. Excuse me. And remember, in addition to what you've mentioned, there's infographics that you can create inside PowerPoint. There are animation vignettes, as we've talked about in previous webinars, that you can use the PowerPoint animations and timings to create, or even trigger them doing various click to reveal. So that's a great example. Again, we don't want to have a wall of text, as this person mentioned. So that's a great point. So, Paulina, are we able to open up voice chat for anyone? Is anyone interested in that?
We are able to do that to enable the, I'm sorry, I mean to unmute anybody of you guys who attend this webinar today. So if you would like to say something, to share something with us and with the audience, could you please send me a quick comment in the chat section so that I can give you the rights to present.
Sure, and keep your eye out for that. And then while you're doing that, is there another question or comment?
Yes, actually a couple of the pretty similar questions. Thoughts about combining audio narration with on-screen text?
So that's interesting. So audio narration and on-screen text. Early on in the webinars, we talked about how much audio narration is too much. And so there's a sweet spot around 30% or so of what you see on screen. But remember, this also can be talked about in other ways. If any of you have seen lynda.com, and by the way, I want to back up, and one resource I did not include in the links, if any of you have the access to the lynda.com information, They have a lot of great things, from A to Z, but also they have a whole section on font and typography. Again, it's a very robust field, and there's a lot of great experts talking, people that are much more versed in it than I. So I would encourage you to go out and look at resources like lynda.com. But on lynda.com, if any of you have taken it, and you know that they have videos associated with it, that they have an on-screen transcript that's highlighted as you go, timed with the audio of the video. So that's not necessarily something we can do here, but that's something to consider. How do the learners we engage, how are they best engaged with the interface? And in your question, how about maybe using narration for the on-screen text? That's a possibility. But remember, in some cases, we may need to turn that off for various users. It may interfere with screen readers. Again, we'll talk about a little bit of this next week on accessibility. But audio needs to be something that really supports and augments the learning without getting in the way of learning, and that's a hard balance to create. So, but that's a good point. So it's one thing you can consider, just like I said, drilling down for more information. Audio can be something, maybe click to activate it, that allows someone to hear someone discuss it or explain it in a verbal sense. So any ways you can allow your user to have control over their learning world or environment is the best course. So.
Okay, so we do have a live question from Irfan. Let me please quickly, well, not so quickly, unmute you.
And remember, everyone, this is an experiment for us all here, so.
Yeah. Hello, Irfan. Can you say something?
Hello.
Hi.
Sure, Paulina. Hi, Michael. Hello, Michael. Can you hear me?
I can hear you better now. Yes, hi.
Okay, sure. Michael, just let me introduce myself first, that I'm a UI designer and just learning UX. I just want to know a very simple question to you, that how can I build UX by following my any UI principle or UI patterns? Can you suggest something in terms of UI in e-learning industry?
Yeah, and first, thank you for popping on here. And second, so you already do the interface part, so the design part, and that's great. So I would, again, so look at the links I shared, and some of those are a really great way to get involved, but also like the video I mentioned on the one page that had I said, check this out because it has a banana. Just like the graphic I showed of the user that walks its own path versus, using the concrete path. Get an understanding of what's best for the learner. And sometimes the only way to do that is to present what you have, whether it's a mock-up or straw man, in front of the learner and go, does this work for you? Is this clear? Is this, what do you feel about this? Does it feel like it's easy to use? Is it cumbersome? And then without that direct response, all we can do is guess. And so the guessing is okay up to a point, but what we really need is that buy-in and approval from our learners. So start with what you're doing is the design, keep what you feel like is good for the learner, but really get in and get your core learners involved.
All right, well, thank you very much, Irfan, for being so brave and stepping out today with your question live. And at this point, I think it looks like we've covered all the questions.
Very good.
All right, and Irfan says, you mean to say by early user testing?
Early user testing is good, and so again, when you create, and maybe you don't do mockups, but if you do create mockups and get buy-in from your SMEs or stakeholders, maybe that can also include, as you mentioned, the early testing factor. But after that, after you've designed it, maybe in the design or development portion where we can do publishes or sort of mock-ups where we do the iSpring publisher, allowing it sort of midway through the process as well. So the early is great, and that would also allow you to get some ideas and ideals to build upon as you do the visuals and the design part, but also understanding what the user experience might be and where it's going. So yes, early on is a great check, but also midway or a little bit past midway as you begin really getting stuff on screen and seeing how it fleshes out. So.
All right, thank you very much. So it looks like at this point we are ready to wrap up. So I would like to remind all of you guys that next week we are going to have a webinar on Thursday, not on Wednesday like we were planning to, because we are going to participate in iSpring user conference. And the next webinar is going to be dedicated to efficiency, viability, and accessibility of your content and how you can ensure it. So when you created your content, you recorded narration, you authored quizzes, added interactivity, now you need to put some finishing touches on the e-learning, and Michael will let us know how we can do that. And yeah, I think that's it for today. And as always, I will be sending all the webinar resources sometime either tomorrow or on Friday. So guys, please expect my message in your inbox. And I would like to thank Michael again, as always, for covering this topic for us today. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you for having me and hosting this webinar series. And thanks everyone for participating. I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining, and I would like also to thank Paul Bender for taking care of our user questions in the question box during the webinar, during the Q&A session. Thank you very much, Paul. We very much appreciate having you today with us.
Thank you, Paulina. I think most of the questions asked today were for Michael, so I didn't have a lot of things to do today, but so yeah, it was nice to participate.
Well,
right,
maybe,
but Paul, if you'd not been here though, like I would have been in trouble. They'd have been all technical questions. So.
Right. Well, I'm sure, Paul, you've also learned something new from Michael and from our audience as well.
That's for sure.
All right, so I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thanks again for coming, and we'll see you at our next webinar next week. Bye-bye, everyone.
Goodbye.